Hello, my friends. Welcome to my corner. As you know, the Nobel Prize in Literature is not awarded to one specific book, but to an author's body of work. Now, there are some cases in which the Nobel Committee has cited a specific work as being of particular importance. I can think of the example of Growth of the Soil by Knut Hamsun, The History of Rome by Theodor Mommsen, The Peasants by Władysław Reymont. There are many other examples, but that is the case also with the second giant of German literature, Thomas Mann. You know who the first giant of German literature is. So even though Thomas Mann had written The Magic Mountain 5 years before he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature, it was his novel Buddenbrooks that the Nobel Committee decided to cite. And let me read you the citation for his Nobel Prize, which he received in the year 1929. He was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature, quote, principally for his great novel Buddenbrooks, which has won steadily increased recognition as one of the classic works of contemporary literature. This is one of the reasons why I decided in my video on Thomas Mann to focus on this novel. So my experience with Thomas Mann began 20 years ago, believe it or not. It's been quite a long time, and I can hardly believe it myself, when I decided to read all of his short stories and novellas. I got an old copy of that volume, Stories of 3 Decades. It also includes some novellas. And that's what I did. And I also had a little book, I remember, with early stories by Thomas Mann that had not been collected in that other volume that cost me a few bucks at Half Price Books. And I loved all of them. Okay, it was a great reading experience. Now, why did I decide to read Thomas Mann in the first place? It's basically this. I found out that Ernesto Sabato was a big fan of Thomas Mann and actually cited him as a huge influence in his work. And in those days, I was really obsessed with the novels of Ernesto Sabato, The Tunnel, On Heroes and Tombs, The Angel of Darkness. So I really enjoyed all of those, and I decided to get every single book that I could get my hands on by Thomas Mann, if he had been such a huge influence on Ernesto Sabato. So I bought all of those books. The only one that I'm missing of his fiction is The Tables of the Law, which is a novella that he was commissioned to write, but I'm gonna get a copy of that one of these days. I have not read them all, sadly. Okay, I have to be honest here. I have read Buddenbrooks, The Magic Mountain, the short stories and novellas that I told you about, plus The Black Swan, which is another novella. So Jorge, why are you not talking about The Magic Mountain? Well, it's it's a nice day, isn't it? No, it's a very long story, and there's going to be more to come about this. So let's just say for the moment that I'm going to be focusing on Buddenbrooks. I first attempted to read Buddenbrooks right after I read the short stories and the novellas, so we're talking 20 years ago. But it was a difficult time in my life. I remember I was going through some health issues and I had to abandon the reading. And actually, I still have the bookmark from those days, and that tells me that I got to page 78 exactly of the novel. So fast forward almost 20 years after that, or a little bit less than that, and during the summer I decided to read The Magic Mountain. That's one of those great summer reads because you need a lot of time to explore books like this. The year after that, I read during the summer also Buddenbrooks, and it happened to be the summer of 2020, and I am sure you remember what happened that year and during that summer. So you could say that, yes, Buddenbrooks was one of my pandemic reads. That's how I think about it after having experienced it during that time. And now that I think about it, I think one of these days I would like to put together a video with my pandemic reads, the things that I read starting from that spring break of March 2020 and probably including the summer, because I think that would be interesting to look back on. So maybe that's a project that I'm going to be working on one of these days. But Buddenbrooks, how would I describe it? I would say that this is one of the most significant and also one of the most satisfying examples of the realist novel. And as such, I would say that it is comparable, not necessarily superior or equal, but comparable to Madame Bovary, to Middlemarch, to Portrait of a Lady, to Anna Karenina, all of those great masterworks of the realist tradition. Now, Thomas Mann himself referred to Buddenbrooks as the only great naturalist novel in German. Now, I think the word naturalist or naturalism as a school of writing, there are many things that we associate with that. I would say that I would rather describe it as realist, but definitely keep that in mind as you explore Buddenbrooks. For many years, it was Thomas Mann's best-selling novel in Germany, and actually, as far as I know, that may still be the case. I would need my friends from Germany here to let me know about that. I can tell you for sure that here in the US, The Magic Mountain is a lot more popular than Buddenbrooks. I know a lot of people who have read The Magic Mountain, not that many people who have read his previous novel, his first one. Here's an interesting thing about it. Mann was inspired by the Goncourt brothers when he was writing this novel, or he made the decision to write it. And he was actually thinking of collaborating with his brother in the writing of Buddenbrooks. As you know, his brother Heinrich Mann was an established author. But besides that, we can also maybe feel the influence of Tolstoy, of Dickens. Those are probably the most obvious ones that I want to mention. So if you look at the text itself, this is 730 pages long. It is divided into 11 parts, very, very brief ones, that also have many chapters to them. But here's the interesting thing. Initially, the novel was going to be only 250 pages, and it was going to focus on the character of Jano. You know how it is. Don Quixote was going to be a short story, okay? But that's not the way it happens sometimes. As I like to say, the text is really an organism. It's not an organization, but an organism. It has a life and a mind of its own if you just let it develop by itself. And that seems to be what happened with Buddenbrooks. And once the text was complete, and Thomas Mann took it to his publisher, the publisher asked him if he could shorten it a little bit, and Thomas Mann just refused. So you can tell that he felt that what he included here in this novel really had to be there. Despite the number of pages, and this is the amazing thing, I would say that this novel is quite a compact story. Though I also have to say that I believe there are parts of it, especially towards the end, that could have been shorter. Okay, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that in a few minutes towards the end of this video. So let's talk about the plot, or the premise, however you want to call it. It's actually, when you think about it, and 730 pages, the story itself is very easy to describe because Buddenbrooks is one of those good old family sagas. And the subtitle that you get right here on the cover also is The Decline of a Family. That is exactly what we get in this novel. The decline of a family illustrated by 4 generations of a German bourgeois family. So if my calculations are correct, the story takes place over a period of roughly 50 years, beginning in 1835, that is certain, and ending sometime in the late 1870s. 4 generations, once again, but the story really focuses on the 3rd generation. And we have 3 characters, 3 siblings in particular, that we are going to hear a lot about. So first we have Thomas, who is industrious. We have his brother Christian, who I would describe as free-spirited and unstable. And last but not least, their sister Toni, or Antonie, who I would describe as headstrong. I think that is the adjective, after thinking about it for a while, that I could come up with that I think reflects her personality in the most accurate way. So if there is one individual protagonist to Buddenbrooks, that would be Toni. She is the first one that we meet in the very first chapter. She is 8 years old at that time. And you can tell that she's going to be an important character from the very beginning. But what we have here in Buddenbrooks is really a collective protagonist, the Buddenbrook family. I think that is obvious. It's really many people that we are following. Their story is presented in an episodic fashion. Okay, so what we find out about this family, we know through a series of births, deaths, illnesses, parties, quarrels, divorces, and especially, this is very important, business transactions. I think business is the focus of this novel, and this novel is really excellent at portraying how the business mentality permeates everything in a society that subscribes to that mentality. All that matters is money and appearances. Now, business goes very well at first when you start reading the novel in the first chapters, but as soon as things get complicated, you're going to see that the characters just do away with every scruple that you can imagine. At one point, for example, there's one of the characters who is hesitant to take advantage of an acquaintance through a business deal. But then one of the siblings says, look, that acquaintance is going to benefit too, in a way, right, from the business deal. And then if we don't take advantage of this person, the rival family will. And, we can't have that, can we? So it's that type of thing, that type of business transaction, that type of behavior that is not really seen as a crime in this society in particular. It is considered simply to be usage. This is what it is called. It's a practice that may seem abusive, but within the business setting, it is acceptable. And I think the underlying philosophy that I find behind all this is that something is a crime only when and only if one is caught. So, in other words, it's a Machiavellian state of affairs that Buddenbrooks describes. Marriages and friendships are, arranged and dissolved according to convenience. And even entertainment is dictated by these rules, by the desire to please those who may be useful to the characters. For example, one of the characters says, let us endure these amusements at one point when they're about to do something quote unquote fun. So you can tell how even entertainment is dictated by the rules of business. Buddenbrooks, this is another important aspect of the novel, is a novel of contrasts. There's a very obvious level at which you can see this, and that has to do with the family's luxury, right? Their luxurious life. We get lots of minute descriptions of clothes, of utensils, of embellishments, things like that. But all of this is contrasted with the inner decay of the family, which is something that you would expect from the very subtitle of the novel, The Decline of a Family. But the critic Martin Swale points out another area in which you can see this contrast and even this balance that I thought was really, really nice, because it has to do with the writing itself, with the mode of writing. The idea that this is a novel that combines objectivity with subjectivity. Thomas Mann was really a master when it came to that. So let me read you the passage from Martin Swale's book on Buddenbrooks in particular, so that you can see what I mean by this. This is a book from 1991, so we're talking a long time ago, but sometimes I don't really believe in judging, critical works by the date in which they were published, but that's another story. So this is what Martin Swale says about Buddenbrooks regarding this objectivity and subjectivity. Buddenbrooks is a supreme example of how novelistic strategies of inwardness, thoughtfulness, and reflectiveness can coexist with a realistic allegiance to the social and institutional substantiality of a specific historical world. It is a novel that fuses inwardness and outwardness. It makes the inner expressive of realistic concerns, and it makes realistic concerns not just outwardly accurate, but also inwardly truthful, insofar as they are shown to be inseparable from the abundantly portrayed psychological and mental life of the characters. I think that sums up better than I could do it, this idea of objectivity and subjectivity being present in this novel simultaneously, and at how well that is done. As a narrative work, another aspect, I would say that Buddenbrooks is just virtually perfect. Okay, that was my impression of the novel. The description, the action, the pace, this sense of the passing of time, which is so difficult to achieve as an author, at least for me, that is probably what I have the most trouble with. I think all of these are practically flawless in Buddenbrooks. And the author was 26 when this novel was published. I'm just ashamed to think of where I was when I was 26. And honestly, in this context, I would say that even now I am ashamed of where I am compared to Thomas Mann, for that matter. Now, at the same time, when I was thinking about that, because I kept repeating to myself when I was reading this novel, he was only 26, he was only 26. Here's something that reminded me, or that I was reminded of when I was thinking about that. Patrick White, right? I talked about him. I talked about Voss, his novel. So let me refer you to that video if you're interested in him. He wrote an autobiography titled Flaws in the Glass. And there's one moment, not very important really, in which he talks about Carson McCullers. great author, okay, one of my favorite authors, who was only 23 when she published The Heart is a Lonely Hunter. By the way, highly recommended novel. And here's the thing. He says that people were like, how could such a young person know so much about all of these dark things, right? The dark corners of the human heart. And Patrick White's answer to that, I've always kept this in mind since I read it, was, well, she can read, can't she? I think what we're dealing here is a topic that I find fascinating. It's like how important, when it comes to writing, is personal lived experience, right? We have, on the one hand, the writer who has experienced all of these things, has had all of these experiences that they turn into writing. On the other hand, you could have a writer who is locked up in a room but surrounded by books. It really has to do with how we see literature. Is literature, or are novels, really about life? Or are novels about literature, about the language itself? So this has to do with the realist versus anti-realist approach, and it's a topic that, you know, we could do another video on. But I think this is what's at play here when it comes to considering what Thomas Mann achieves in Buddenbrooks. At the same time, nobody's perfect. Okay, I said that I believe this is practically flawless, but towards the end of Buddenbrooks, I found some slight imperfections. Okay, let's call them that. To me, for example, the chapters describing Hanno's vacation and his school day seemed like expendable, pretty much. There's the school day chapter in particular, which is chapter 2 of part 11. I don't know, I found that to be particularly tiresome. We hear a lot about the anxiety of being called on by the teacher, for example, and this goes on for so many pages. And by the way, this chapter on Hanno's school day is the longest chapter in the novel. It's 50 pages long, pretty much. So that's quite long when you compare it to the other chapters. But at the same time, the ending of that chapter is great. So I feel that that makes the offense pardonable in a way. And I think that Thomas Mann should have grabbed this chapter and just published it as a short story. It works wonderfully as a short story because of the structure and because of the ending. But in the novel, it may seem a little bit out of place. So that is my take. If we're going to look for the cat's fifth leg, as I always say, you know, that saying in Spanish, you know, buscarle la quinta pata al gato. So those are my thoughts on that. So the bottom line, if you like realism, if you like family sagas, then I think you're going to love Buddenbrooks. It requires time, of course, because it is a long novel, but I would not describe it as a challenging novel. It is not a difficult story to follow. Now, if you're coming from the Magic Mountain, I just want you to know this. This is a whole nother animal, okay? It's a completely different thing. That could be a good thing or it could be a bad thing. It really depends on how you feel about the Magic Mountain. So if you hated the Magic Mountain, you may love Buddenbrooks, and vice versa. If you're a huge fan of the Magic Mountain, you may read this one and be like, okay, we have another family saga right here. Could also be the case that you love both of them, okay? But I just wanted to point that out. In my opinion, this is just one of the most elegant novels that I have ever read, so I highly recommend it. So, Jorge, what about the Magic Mountain, okay? So, as I said, we're going to talk about that some other day, but I have good news for you. My friend Mike has a wonderful video on the Magic Mountain. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to link that video in the description to this one. So definitely check it out and say hello to Mike for me, okay? So do you have any questions, comments, recommendations, recipes? Just let me know. Those were my 2 cents on Buddenbrooks by Thomas Mann. Thank you so much for stopping by and have a wonderful day.